2 years ago, the content creator Possible History released a video outlining his concept of Rome, where everything fits perfectly. Inspired by his analysis and thoughts on what a perfect Rome could be, I decided to present my interpretation of this intriguing thought experiment about Rome, where everything goes smoothly. But this time, I will not make this video alone. During our analysis and alternative history of perfected Rome, user AlterArc will join me to work on this specific topic. Together, we will explore the history of Rome over the centuries and try to conclude what the ideal Rome could be. Without further ado, let's start this video about what it would be like if everything went perfectly for Rome. First of all, I want to clarify that we will consider events only after Octavian Augustus ascended the throne as the first emperor of the Roman Empire to make necessary changes and create the perfect Rome. If we had started changes before this moment, for example during the Punic Wars, or even at the founding of the Roman Republic after the abolition of the monarchy, we would not be talking about the Rome we know. This would be a completely different, unfamiliar Rome, making it difficult to predict the changes we could make. Moreover, this video series is dedicated to what would have happened if everything had gone perfectly for the Roman Empire, rather than the Roman Republic, which were very different things. If you're curious about what would happen if everything went perfectly for the Roman Republic, let me know in the comments below. Perhaps in the future, I or AlterArc can make a video on this topic, or even conduct another collaboration. Rome in its early days was a civilization built on hardships and deprivations that it endured. Without these very deprivations, Rome would not have become the Rome we know. For this reason, we will start changes only after the beginning of the empire, leaving everything that happened before this event unchanged, as in our timeline. Considering all that has been said, what could Augustus add to his already great reign to further improve the future prosperity of the empire and ensure its long-term sustainability? The first thing to address, of course, will be to prevent numerous succession crises in the future. August never established a clear, legitimate, and universally recognized method of imperial succession. What he should have done is formalize the inheritance mechanisms approved by the Senate with a system of heirs combining adoption, merit, and senatorial approval, to avoid future instability like that which occurred in the year of the four emperors in 69 AD. This could ensure smoother transitions of power and eliminate coups or civil wars due to inheritance, or at least significantly reduce the risk of it. Speaking of the inheritance crisis, it is also necessary to address the second issue to ensure the long-term prosperity of Rome: reforming the Senate. For this, Augustus will have to do what he has never dared to do in our history: fully accept the end of the Roman Republic and not be afraid to show his role as the absolute leader of the now Roman Empire, as well as not shy away from using terms like empire and dictator, thereby rejecting the hypocrisy that was and remains democracy. The Senate under Augustus remained as a facade but had actually lost real power, creating tensions with the emperors. However, he could simply transform the Senate into a true advisory body with regional representation, giving it real control over provincial governors and finances, turning it into a stabilizing force rather than a passive institution accumulating discontent and envy over time. Thus, the nobility would remain politically engaged and loyal to the system, rather than becoming conspirators. A third problem requiring resolution would be finding a more effective way to integrate the provinces through reforming citizenship laws. Although today, when we think of the Roman Empire, we see it as a vast territory painted in red. For a long time, the Roman Empire regarded its supposed provinces as colonies rather than as actual territories integrated into the empire. This began to change only after Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to all free people in the empire in the year 212 AD. Even then, it can be imagined that socially, only Italians and possibly Greeks considered themselves true Romans. The provinces felt like colonies rather than integrated parts of the empire. Citizenship was limited and hard to obtain without exceptional deeds for the empire or service in its armed forces for more than 2 decades, which very few could endure, especially in less prosperous times. To solve this problem, it would be necessary to begin the gradual expansion of citizenship in advance, linking it to military service, education, and loyalty, as well as to create local senates and provincial assemblies for the representation of local residents. Over time, this could create a deeper loyalty to Rome, reduce the number of uprisings, and accelerate the process of Romanization. Speaking of the army, the fourth problem that needed to be addressed was control over the armed forces. Generals typically won the loyalty of legions too easily in difficult times, leading to civil wars. One way to solve this problem could be to limit the terms of governors and frequently rotate commanders, as well as to create a centralized military academy to train officers loyal to the emperor, and a permanent imperial guard not based in Rome to avoid praetorian power. This could have prevented military usurpations during civil wars, like in the year 69 AD, as well as during the crisis of the 3rd century. The fifth problem to solve would be economic diversification. Excessive dependence on agriculture, slavery, and plunder for wealth accumulation in the long term led to a lack of innovation and investment in the broader economy. The solution would be investing in state industry, technological innovations, water mills, tools, shipping, and infrastructure. It is necessary to encourage entrepreneurship, reduce slavery by promoting the labor of the freed, which, by the way, has already happened in our history, especially with the reforms regarding slaves carried out by Emperor Antoninus Pius, which clearly shows the presence of debates and questions regarding the issue of slavery. If we carefully study that period, and the generous progressive reforms carried out by 5 benevolent emperors, I have no doubt that if the Pax Romana had continued with more great emperors than just 5, slavery would ultimately have been abolished or significantly reduced naturally, as it happened later in our history with European empires. In any case, this could create a more resilient and diverse economy capable of surviving military downturns and pandemics. The sixth question is the elimination of tension at the eastern border. For more than 7 centuries, Parthia, and later the Sassanid Persians, remained a powerful threat that Rome never fully defeated on its eastern front. A temporary solution to this problem could be the construction of a massive Mesopotamian wall, similar to Hadrian's Wall, which would better protect the empire from Parthian and Sassanid attacks, creating a long-term defense like the walls of China. This would bring positive changes in the form of a more stable eastern front, eliminating endless campaigns and reducing pressure on the legions, which could be very useful in the future, as during the war between Byzantium and the Sassanids in the 7th century AD. The seventh, and perhaps the most important question that needs to be resolved, not only for the future of the Roman Empire, but for the entire Western world and beyond, is religious and cultural unification. Religion may have been politically useful, but it was also a stagnating and very dangerous force. Христианство позже стало разделяющим фактором и, безусловно, не способствовало падению империи. Даже если вы считаете, что христианство не было главной причиной упадка Римской империи, римляне должны были вместо этого поощрять синкретический имперский культ, включающий провинциальных богов и способствующий панримской идентичности, а также финансировать многонациональное образование для римской элиты, не стирая их культуры и всегда поддерживая независимо от обстоятельств политику терпимости ко всем религиям в империи, независимо от того, насколько сильной или популярной становится эта религия. One should never be afraid to ally with the most radical representatives of a religion that seeks to dominate others. This could possibly, over time, but not without enormous difficulties, create cultural cohesion, reduce division, and ensure a smoother response to emerging ideologies such as Christianity. The last question that could be solved in the early stages of the empire's existence would be proper urban planning and population distribution. Rome was overcrowded, which did not match the level of their technology, while other parts of the empire remained underdeveloped. They should develop a decentralization plan and create model cities throughout the imperial space, something like many Romes, encouraging settlement in sparsely populated areas such as North Africa or Gaul at that time, and later in places like Deia, when Trajan conquers these lands in the early 2nd century AD. This would lead to more balanced growth, reduced pressure on Rome, and strengthened border zones. But I will leave the consequences of all these changes that occurred in the 1st century BC and AD for Altarach's analysis in the context of the 2nd century AD, when the era of Roman peace reached its peak. Your turn. Altarach, what changes do you think the Romans could make in the next century to improve the long-term consequences for their future? Thank you, Emperor Chaos. Before discussing the changes the Romans might make, we need to talk about how Augustus's new reforms, related to the founding of the Roman Empire, affected Rome at this moment in time. Thanks to Augustus's alternative reforms regarding the proper transfer of power, we are beginning to observe a more consistent trend towards the ascension of more capable and competent emperors. With the organized system of the military academy and stricter control over the loyalty of generals, civil wars and murders that occurred in our timeline will no longer be so widespread. Instead, a stable transfer of power will become the norm from this moment on. This also means that in the future, it will be difficult for us to determine who rules the Roman Empire. The fact that there is now a more stable transfer of power does not mean there will not be bad leaders, murders, and even possible civil wars over the transfer of power in future Rome. However, the number of such events will significantly decrease. This will lead to a substantial reduction in the periods of decline for Rome in the future. In our timeline, there were about 16 major civil wars throughout the history of the Roman Empire, with 1/3 to half of all Roman emperors being killed or dying a violent death. I believe that with the new measures we have implemented, we can prevent such alternative civil wars and murders involving various emperors who will come to power in this alternative timeline. This means that by the end of the 2nd century, we will have already prevented 3 civil wars. Moreover, all the changes made by Emperor Chaos will play an important role in significantly improving Rome's expansionist policies in the 2nd century. The first thing we need to change in Rome's expansionist policy this century concerns the European kingdom of Dacia. In our story, the Romans conquered Dacia, but holding on to the region cost them a significant amount, and ultimately they abandoned it, unable to properly integrate it into the empire, and the region proved difficult to defend. In our ideal scenario, the Romans conquered Dacia, but instead of annexing it into their territories, they establish a puppet kingdom, similar to Rome's puppet kingdoms in the East. Thus, Rome will be able to extract natural resources from Dacia, establish protocols to control puppet monarchs, so that Dacia does not secede. Over time, the Romans will be able to Romanize Dacia to a certain extent, in order to maintain the loyalty of the local population and strengthen the army to protect themselves and Rome from the barbarians. In the end, Rome will have a strong and loyal buffer state to protect it from barbarians without the need to hold difficult and unstable territory. Rome could do something similar with other client states in its sphere of influence throughout this century. The most significant change in Roman expansionism is associated with the war against Parthia. In our story, the Romans under Trajan were able to temporarily conquer Mesopotamia from the 11th to the 17th year of our era, but soon lost control and were forced to retreat under Hadrian, who focused more on defense. The Romans temporarily lost Armenia twice between the 60s and 60s AD before they were able to regain it. Having avoided 3 civil wars in this century, thanks to the wealth from new Roman cities established throughout the empire, improved economic policies, greater cultural integration, and increased investments in technological and administrative fields, the Roman Empire will acquire the means to construct the Great Mesopotamian Wall, which will be built in this historical context, and secure the eastern flank of the Roman Empire. This wall will be about 3 times larger than Hadrian's Wall, which took around 6 years to build. Based on this logic, if the Great Wall of Mesopotamia is built in the same way as Hadrian's Wall, it will take about 18 years to complete. Fewer legions will be needed to protect Rome from the Parthians, and Rome will be able to more steadily control Armenia, then annex it, using the newly built wall as a border between the Roman Empire and Parthia, as well as a permanent defense against the Parthians until they can conquer them. The amount of time, resources, and effort that will now be saved by avoiding all campaigns conducted between Parthia and Rome is impossible to overestimate. Taking into account all the preserved resources and previous reforms, Rome can now strengthen its power by focusing on the capture of territories that will truly benefit their empire. Rome could start by fully controlling the Black Sea. Since significantly fewer legions will be involved in conflicts with the Parthians, the Romans will be able to focus on strengthening their control over the Black Sea to connect and annex their client states, as well as expand into the Germanic tribes after securing the eastern flank. In our story, the Romans gave up their attempts to conquer the Germanic tribes after the battle in the Teutoburg Forest. However, considering all the changes that have occurred so far, the Roman Empire will gradually begin campaigns against the Germanic tribes. Around the year 180 AD, they will be able to fully annex the Germanic tribes up to the river Ali and integrate them into the empire, providing the Romans access to the rich resources of the Germanic tribes and easing border protection against barbarians. From here, the Romans will be able to develop more diplomatic trade relations with him, the Kushite kingdom, and Bellamy to gain more benefits from these trade connections and to establish 3 new alliances. Over time, they can make these states so dependent on trade with Rome that they will become client states of the Roman Empire, and at Rome's whim, puppet kingdoms to secure the southern flank in Egypt. As for the British Isles, in our history, the Romans lost many men trying to break through Hadrian's Wall in Caledonia, but ultimately failed. In this alternative history, they will instead remain at the wall for a whole century if the wall was still built in this version of events by Korean or another leader who came to power. Although in this alternative timeline, thanks to reforms, Rome could have successfully conquered Caledonia. They will be occupied with concentrating legions on the Germanic tribes and securing the eastern flank. Therefore, it would be wiser for Rome to focus on these conquests rather than on the subjugation of Caledonia, which can be done in the next century. Considering all these changes, the Roman Empire has much more stable and easily defensible borders compared to our history, using European rivers, puppet kingdoms, and newly built walls in the east and Britain for easier protection of the empire. One of the last significant changes we are beginning to observe is a different common culture in Rome, where Romans adopt the cultures of other peoples and view them as part of their empire rather than as colonies. Moreover, the empire itself is evolving into a more modern style compared to the ancient model it adhered to earlier, which is a rather interesting consequence of all the changes we made. The Romans achieved many significant conquests, which were actively used in propaganda, making the citizens of the Roman Empire much more satisfied with the current state of affairs.